The cracking sound of splintering wood echoed through the desolate Nevada landscape as Frances Cooper's wagon collapsed beneath the weight of her worldly possessions. She stood frozen in disbelief, dust swirling around her skirts, the merciless June sun of 1872 beating down upon her weary shoulders. Everything she owned, everything she had salvaged from her former life in Boston, now lay scattered across the rugged trail less than 10 miles from her destination of Truckee. Frances pushed back a strand of auburn hair that had escaped her practical bun, fighting the urge to succumb to tears. At 25, she had already weathered more storms than most women twice her age, and she refused to let a broken wagon axle be her undoing. Still, as she surveyed the damage, reality settled heavily upon her. Without help, she would never reach Truckee before nightfall, and the wilderness held dangers she preferred not to contemplate. The sound of approaching hoofbeats caused her to turn sharply, one hand instinctively moving to the small derringer hidden in the pocket of her dusty traveling dress. A lone rider appeared on the horizon, silhouetted against the vast Nevada sky. Frances squared her shoulders, preparing herself for whatever or whoever approached. "Looks like you've got yourself in quite a predicament, madam," the rider called as he drew closer. His voice carried easily on the dry breeze, a deep baritone with a hint of Texas in its cadence. The stranger dismounted with the fluid grace of a man who had spent most of his life in the saddle. He was taller than any man Frances had encountered, with broad shoulders and sun-bronzed skin that spoke of years under the western sun. His eyes, a startling shade of blue, assessed the wreckage of her wagon with practiced efficiency. "Mason Finley," he said, removing his hat and offering a respectful nod. "Seems your axle couldn't take the burden." "Frances Cooper," she replied, struggling to maintain her composure. "I was told this wagon would make it to Truckee without incident. Clearly, I was misinformed." Mason circled the wagon, his expression thoughtful as he examined the broken axle and the scattered belongings. "You heading to Truckee alone, Miss Cooper?" "Mrs. Cooper," Frances corrected automatically, then wished she hadn't. The title felt hollow now, a painful reminder of all she had lost. "And yes, I am traveling alone." Mason nodded, asking no further questions, for which Frances was grateful. The West had taught him that everyone carried secrets and most preferred to keep them buried. "Well, Mrs. Cooper, I can't fix this axle out here, but I can help you salvage what's important and get you to Truckee before nightfall." He gestured toward his sturdy paint horse. "Thunder here can carry double for a while, and we can load the essentials on my pack horse." Frances hesitated, weighing her limited options. Trust did not come easily to her anymore, not after everything that had transpired in Boston, yet something in the cowboy's steady gaze reassured her. "I would be most appreciative, Mr. Finley," she finally said. Together, they sorted through her belongings: clothing, books, a few precious family heirlooms, and the supplies she had purchased to start her new life. Mason worked methodically, his strong hands carefully handling her possessions as if they were priceless treasures, teaching supplies. He questioned, noting the primers and slate boards. Frances nodded. "I've accepted a position as the school teacher in Truckee." A smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Town's been waiting for a proper teacher for months. The children have been running wild as jackrabbits." As they worked, Frances found herself studying the cowboy when he wasn't looking. His movements were precise and efficient, his manner respectful. Unlike most men she had encountered on her journey west, he didn't speak unnecessarily or attempt to impress her with tales of his exploits. "That should do it," Mason announced as he secured the last bundle to his pack horse. "We'll have to leave the wagon and some of the heavier items. I can return tomorrow with a proper wagon to retrieve them." Frances glanced at the abandoned pieces of furniture, the small writing desk that had belonged to her mother, the trunk containing linens for her new home. "I suppose there's no choice." "Don't worry, Mrs. Cooper. Thieves are scarce in these parts, and anything with real value is coming with us." With Mason's assistance, Frances mounted Thunder, acutely aware of the impropriety of their situation. But propriety seemed a luxury ill-suited to the realities of the West, so she pushed her concerns aside as Mason swung up behind her. "Hold steady," he advised, his voice close to her ear as he took up the reins. "It's not the most comfortable arrangement, but we'll make good time." The journey to Truckee was unlike anything Frances had experienced. The vastness of the landscape both terrified and exhilarated her. Mountains rose in the distance, their snow-capped peaks gleaming despite the summer heat. Mason pointed out landmarks and wildlife as they traveled, his knowledge of the territory impressive. "You know this area well," Frances observed. "Been running cattle in these parts for 5 years now," he replied. "My ranch is about 15 miles east of Truckee, small operation but growing steadily." "You live alone?" The question escaped before Frances could consider its propriety. Mason chuckled, the sound rumbling through his chest. "Just me and my ranch hands 3 good men who have been with me since Texas. Though I suspect they stay more for my cook's biscuits than my charming company." As they approached Truckee, Frances felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. The small frontier town represented her future, a future she had chosen out of necessity rather than desire. "The schoolhouse is just beyond the church," Mason explained as they entered the town's main street. "And there's a small cottage attached for the teacher. Town council fixed it up special when they sent for you." Curious eyes followed their progress. Frances felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment at the spectacle. They must present the new schoolteacher arriving on the same horse as one of the local ranchers. "Don't mind them," Mason said quietly. "News travels faster than dust in a windstorm out here. By supper time, everyone will know exactly what happened with your wagon." The cottage, when they reached it, exceeded Frances's expectations. Small but sturdy, with a covered porch and fresh white paint, it stood adjacent to the schoolhouse. Mason helped her dismount, then began unloading her belongings. "I can manage from here," Frances said, straightening her travel-worn dress. "You've already done more than enough, Mr. Finley." "Mason," he corrected with a gentle smile, "and I'll see these things inside before I go. My mother would haunt me something fierce if I left a lady to wrestle with trunks and bundles." Inside, the cottage boasted simple but well-crafted furniture: a pine table with 4 chairs, a cushioned rocking chair by the stone fireplace, and a narrow bed with a handmade quilt in the single bedroom. Frances felt an unexpected surge of emotion at the thoughtfulness evident in the preparation of her new home. "The town council asked the ladies' auxiliary to make things comfortable," Mason explained as he placed the last of her trunks in the bedroom. "Mrs. Whitaker, she runs the general store with her husband, organized it all." Frances struggled to find words that could adequately express her gratitude, both for the town's welcome and for Mason's timely assistance. "I don't know how to thank you properly," she finally said. Mason replaced his hat, his expression warm but respectful. "No thanks necessary, Mrs. Cooper. I'll head back out tomorrow to salvage what's left of your wagon and bring the rest of your belongings." "At least let me offer you supper tomorrow evening," Frances said impulsively. "It's the least I can do." A slow smile spread across Mason's face, transforming his weathered features. "I'd be honored." Around 6, after he departed, Frances stood in the center of her new home, overwhelmed by the day's events. The journey from Boston had been arduous, first by train to Sacramento, then by stagecoach, and finally by the ill-fated wagon. Yet somehow she had arrived at her destination, thanks to the unexpected kindness of a stranger. As she unpacked her meager possessions, Frances found herself thinking about Mason Finley, his quiet strength, his respectful manner, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. It had been a long time since she had noticed such things about a man, and the realization unsettled her. "This is not why you came west," she reminded herself firmly as she placed her teaching certificates on the small desk by the window. "You came to start anew, to build a respectable life far from Boston's memories." Yet as she prepared for bed that night, Frances could not help but anticipate Mason's return the following day with a fluttering in her stomach that felt remarkably like hope, a sentiment she had abandoned many months ago. The morning brought a flurry of visitors to Frances's cottage, each bearing welcome gifts and barely concealed curiosity. Mrs. Whittaker arrived first, a robust woman with kind eyes and capable hands, bringing freshly baked bread and preserved peaches. "We're so pleased you've arrived safely, Mrs. Cooper," she said, her keen gaze taking in Francis's neat appearance. "Though I hear your journey ended with some excitement," Francis smiled politely. "News does travel quickly here. Small towns run on two things, dear hard work and gossip, and the latter requires far less effort, Mrs. Whittaker laughed. "Mason Finley is a good man, one of the best in these parts." The statement seemed to carry additional meaning, but Francis merely nodded. "I was fortunate he happened by when he did." Throughout the morning, other townspeople stopped to introduce themselves, the Reverend and his wife, the mayor, several mothers with children who would soon be her pupils. Each conversation included some mention of Mason, always delivered with a meaningful glance or suggestive smile that Francis pretended not to notice. By midday, she had begun organizing the schoolhouse, grateful for the distraction from her thoughts about the handsome rancher. The one-room building was larger than she had expected, with rows of sturdy benches and a blackboard that spanned the front wall. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating motes of dust that danced in the air. The sound of wagon wheels drew her attention. Through the window, she saw Mason approaching, driving a wagon laden with her remaining possessions. Frances smoothed her hair and straightened her simple calico dress before stepping outside. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Cooper," Mason called, tipping his hat. "Found everything just as we left it." "You're earlier than I expected," Francis replied, moving to help as he began unloading. "Wanted to get your things to you before they baked any longer in the sun." His smile was warm, his movements efficient as he carried her mother's writing desk inside. "Where would you like this?" They worked together, arranging furniture and unpacking crates, their conversation flowing more easily than Francis would have anticipated. Mason spoke of his ranch and his plans to expand his herd, while Francis shared stories of her teaching experiences in Boston, carefully avoiding any mention of her husband or the circumstances that had driven her west. "You'll have your hands full with some of these youngsters," Mason warned as they placed the last trunk in the bedroom. "The Donovan twins are notorious for mischief, and young Billy Hatcher hasn't met a rule he couldn't bend." Francis laughed, a genuine sound that surprised her with its ease. "I once taught a class of 30 boys in Boston's North End. I suspect Truckee's children will seem tame by comparison." Mason leaned against the doorframe, studying her with evident admiration. "I believe you'd handle them just fine, Mrs. Cooper." The intensity of his gaze made Francis acutely aware of their proximity in the small bedroom. She moved past him back to the main room of the cottage. "I should start preparing supper. You're still joining me, I hope." "Wouldn't miss it," Mason replied, following her. "Though I should warn you, I've spent years eating my own cooking, so my standards might be embarrassingly low," Francis smiled. "Then I shall endeavor not to exceed them too dramatically. I wouldn't want to spoil you." The meal she prepared was simple roasted chicken, potatoes, and early summer vegetables purchased from Mrs. Whittaker's store, but Mason ate with evident appreciation. Frances found herself enjoying his company, his stories of cattle drives and frontier justice, the respectful way he listened when she spoke of her passion for education. "Why Truckee?" he asked as they finished the apple pie she had purchased for dessert. "Of all the places you could have chosen to teach, why come to this dusty corner of Nevada?" Frances hesitated, weighing how much to reveal. "I needed a fresh start," she finally said, "somewhere far from Boston where no one knew me or my history." Mason nodded, asking no further questions, though his eyes reflected understanding. "The West is good for fresh starts. Most folks out here are running toward something or away from something, sometimes both. And you, Mr. Finley, what brought you to Nevada?" He smiled at her use of his formal name. "I thought we'd progressed to Mason by now." Frances felt her cheeks warm. "Mason, then. I came looking for something that was mine alone," he said thoughtfully. "My father had a successful ranch in Texas, but it would never have been truly mine always, my father's legacy, my father's land, my father's way of doing things." I wanted to build something with my own two hands, succeed or fail on my own terms. And have you succeeded, that is? Mason's expression grew reflective. I'm on my way. The ranch turns a profit most years. I've got good grazing land and clean water, but he paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. But, Francis prompted. A ranch needs more than cattle and grass to truly succeed, he said quietly. It needs a future beyond one man's lifetime, a purpose larger than profit. His words hung in the air between them, laden with meaning neither was ready to acknowledge. Frances busied herself clearing the dishes, unsettled by the direction of her thoughts. I should be going, Mason said, rising from the table. Thank you for the meal, best I've had in longer than I can remember. At the door, he paused, hat in hand. The town's hosting a dance Saturday next to welcome you properly. I'd be honored to escort you if you're agreeable. Frances hesitated only briefly. I would like that. After Mason departed, Frances sat in the rocking chair by the fireplace, contemplating the unexpected turn her life had taken. She had come to Truckee seeking anonymity and independence, a place to heal from the wounds of her past. She had not anticipated Mason Finley with his quiet strength and perceptive gaze. It's merely gratitude, she assured herself, nothing more. Yet as she prepared for bed, Frances could not deny the flutter of anticipation she felt at the thought of seeing him again. It was a dangerous feeling, one she had sworn never to indulge after the bitter lessons of her marriage. Trust had betrayed her once before. She could not afford to let it do so again. Still, as sleep claimed her, Frances found herself dreaming of blue eyes and a gentle smile, of strong hands that handled delicate possessions with unexpected care. And for the first time in many months, her dreams were not haunted by the shadows of Boston. The week passed in a flurry of activity as Frances prepared for the start of the school term. She organized textbooks, prepared lesson plans, and memorized the names of her future students from the enrollment list provided by the town council. The work was a welcome distraction from thoughts of Mason Finley, though she found herself looking up expectantly whenever the door to the schoolhouse opened. On Thursday afternoon, Frances was arranging readers on the students' desks when a soft knock interrupted her concentration. She turned to find a young woman standing in the doorway, perhaps 18 or 19 years old, with honey blonde hair and a tentative smile. Mrs. Cooper, I'm Molly Jenkins. My pa runs the livery stable. The girl stepped inside, her calico dress neatly pressed despite the summer heat. Mrs. Whitaker suggested I might call on you. She mentioned you might need help getting settled before classes begin. Frances welcomed the girl with genuine warmth. How thoughtful of Mrs. Whitaker and of you to offer, Miss Jenkins. Molly's smile brightened. I've always wanted to be a teacher someday. I thought perhaps I might learn something watching you prepare. Did you attend school here in Truckee? Yes, madam, until I was 16. But our last teacher, well, he wasn't much interested in girls learning beyond basic reading and figures. Molly's expression grew wistful. I've been trying to continue my studies on my own. Frances recognized the hunger for knowledge in the young woman's eyes, a reflection of her own passion for learning that had propelled her through the rigorous teachers' college in Boston, despite her family's limited means. Would you be interested in assisting me during the school year? I could continue your education after hours in exchange for help with the younger children. Molly's face illuminated with joy. Truly, oh, Mrs. Cooper, I would be ever so grateful. As they worked together organizing the schoolhouse, Molly proved to be not only eager but remarkably intelligent. Frances found herself enjoying the girl's company and her refreshing perspective on Truckee and its inhabitants. So, Molly said as they sorted primers, I hear Mr. Finley rescued you when your wagon broke down. Frances glanced up, recognizing the barely suppressed curiosity in Molly's voice. He was kind enough to assist me, yes. Half the unmarried ladies in Truckee have set their caps for him, Molly continued, arranging books with studied casualness. And quite a few married ones too, I suspect, though they'd never admit it. I can see why, Frances replied neutrally. He seems a respectable gentleman with a successful ranch. Molly laughed, the sound bright in the quiet schoolroom. "Oh, Mrs. Cooper, he's the most eligible bachelor for 50 miles. Handsome as sin, begging your pardon, and rich too, or getting there. They say he's doubled his herd every year since arriving." "You seem well informed about Mr. Finley's affairs," Frances observed with amusement. The girl blushed. "Everyone knows everyone's business here, and Mr. Finley, well, he keeps to himself mostly, except for business. That's why folks are talking about him helping you. It's not like him to get involved." Frances absorbed this information with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "He mentioned escorting me to the welcome dance on Saturday." Molly's eyes widened. "Did he now?" "Well, that will certainly give the gossips something to chew on. Mr. Finley hasn't attended a social function in Truckee since the Christmas gathering 2 years ago, and then only because Mayor Harrison practically dragged him there." Despite herself, Frances felt a small thrill at this revelation. She quickly suppressed it, reminding herself of the promises she had made after fleeing Boston to focus on her teaching, to rebuild her life independently, to guard her heart against further harm. Saturday evening arrived with clear skies and a gentle breeze that carried the scent of pine from the surrounding mountains. Frances stood before the small mirror in her bedroom, critically assessing her appearance. The blue dress, one of the few fine garments she had brought from Boston, complemented her auburn hair and fair complexion. It was modest by Eastern standards, with its high neckline and long sleeves, yet the fitted bodice and flowing skirt were more elegant than anything she had worn since leaving Massachusetts. A knock at the cottage door sent her heart racing unexpectedly. Frances took a steadying breath, reminding herself that this was merely a social obligation, nothing more. Mason stood on her porch, hat in hand, wearing a clean black coat over a crisp white shirt. His hair, usually tousled from his hat, had been neatly combed, and he had shaved, revealing a strong jawline that his usual stubble obscured. The effect was striking, transforming the rugged cowboy into a gentleman who would not have looked out of place in Boston's finest parlors. "Mrs. Cooper," he said, his voice catching slightly as he took in her appearance. "You look beautiful." Frances felt a blush rise to her cheeks. "Thank you, you clean up rather nicely yourself, Mr. Finley." He offered his arm with a smile. "Shall we give the gossips something worth talking about?" The town hall had been transformed for the occasion, with paper lanterns casting a warm glow over the proceedings. Long tables laden with food lined one wall, while a small group of musicians played lively tunes on fiddles and a battered piano. Nearly every resident of Truckee seemed to be in attendance, from elderly couples to young children who darted between the adults in games of tag. Frances felt the weight of curious stares as Mason escorted her into the hall. Whispers followed in their wake, accompanied by knowing smiles and nudges. "I'm beginning to understand why you avoid these gatherings," she murmured to Mason. He chuckled, his hand warm against the small of her back. "It's not the attention I mind so much as the expectations that come with it." Before Frances could ask what he meant, Mrs. Whitaker descended upon them, her round face beaming with satisfaction. "Mrs. Cooper and Mason Finley, as I live and breathe, wonders never cease." "Good evening, Mrs. Whitaker," Mason replied with good-natured resignation. "Quite a turnout tonight. Everyone wanted to welcome our new schoolteacher properly." The older woman turned to Frances. "And you must meet everyone. Come, dear, let me introduce you around. Mason knows all these folks, already been avoiding them for years, haven't you, Mason?" As Mrs. Whitaker swept her away, Frances glanced back at Mason with an apologetic smile. He winked at her, the gesture unexpectedly playful from such a serious man, before making his way toward a group of ranchers gathered near the refreshment table. The next hour passed in a whirl of introductions and conversations. Frances met parents of future students, town officials, and various merchants, each welcoming her with genuine warmth while subtly probing for details about her connection to Mason Finley. "He's never brought anyone to a social before," Mrs. Harrison, the mayor's wife, confided as they watched Mason conversing with a group of men. "Not in all the years he's been in Truckee." "We're merely acquaintances," Frances insisted. He was kind enough to help when my wagon broke down, Mrs. Harrison's knowing smile suggested she found this explanation inadequate. Mason Finley doesn't do anything without purpose, Mrs. Cooper. If he brought you here tonight, it means something. Before Frances could formulate a response, the music shifted to a waltz, and Mason appeared at her side, extending his hand. May I have this dance, Mrs. Cooper? Relief at escaping further interrogation mingled with a flutter of nervousness as Frances placed her hand in his. I should warn you, it's been some time since I've danced. Mason led her to the center of the room where other couples were already forming a circle. Just follow my lead, he said, placing his hand respectfully at her waist. I promise not to step on your toes. As they moved into the dance, Frances was surprised by Mason's grace. He guided her through the steps with confident ease, his movements fluid despite his imposing size. You dance remarkably well for a cowboy, she observed, relaxing into the rhythm. Mason smiled down at her. My mother insisted all her sons learn properly, said a man who could dance would never want for female company. A wise woman. She was, he agreed, a shadow of old grief crossing his features. She passed away 10 years ago. I'm sorry, Frances said softly. I lost my mother 3 years ago. It leaves an emptiness that never quite fills. Their eyes met in a moment of shared understanding that transcended words. Around them, the other dancers, the music, the curious onlookers all seemed to fade into insignificance as they moved together in perfect harmony. When the music ended, neither moved immediately, reluctant to break the connection that had formed between them. Finally, Mason stepped back, his hand lingering on hers for a moment longer than necessary. Would you care for some refreshment? He asked, his voice rougher than usual. They made their way to the punch bowl, where Mason procured drinks for them both. As they sipped the sweet beverage, Frances noticed several young women watching Mason with undisguised interest. It seems your admirers are disappointed this evening, she remarked, nodding discreetly toward the group. Mason followed her gaze and shrugged. They're not interested in me, not really. They're interested in the ranch, the cattle, the land. His expression grew more serious. Out here, a woman needs a husband to survive, and a man with property is a better bet than most. You sound rather cynical for someone so young, Frances observed. 32 isn't so young, Mason replied with a half smile. And experience has taught me to recognize the difference between someone wanting me and someone wanting what I can provide. Frances felt a pang of empathy. Her own marriage had taught her similar lessons, though from a different perspective. Perhaps you underestimate yourself, Mr. Finley. His eyes met hers, searching. Mason, he corrected gently, and perhaps you overestimate the romantic notions of frontier women, Frances. Her name on his lips sent an unexpected warmth through her. Before she could respond, Mayor Harrison approached, clapping Mason on the shoulder with familiar ease. Finley, glad you could tear yourself away from those cattle of yours for one evening. The mayor, a portly man with an impressive mustache, turned to Frances with a jovial smile. Mrs. Cooper, we're delighted to have you in Truckee. I trust everyone has made you feel welcome. The conversation turned to the upcoming school term, the number of children enrolled, and the town council's plans to purchase new textbooks. Throughout the exchange, Frances remained acutely aware of Mason beside her, his steady presence a curious comfort in the unfamiliar gathering. As the evening progressed, they danced twice more, conversed with various townspeople, and eventually found themselves standing on the porch outside the hall, enjoying the cool night air and relative privacy. Thank you for escorting me tonight, Frances said, drawing her shawl more closely around her shoulders against the evening chill. Mason removed his coat and placed it gently around her before she could protest. The weight of it settled on her shoulders, warm from his body and carrying his scent leather, pine, and something uniquely him. The pleasure was entirely mine, he replied, his voice low in the darkness. I haven't enjoyed myself at one of these gatherings in, well, I'm not sure I ever have until tonight. Frances smiled up at him, struck by how natural it felt to stand beside this man she had known for scarcely a week. I suspect Mrs. Whittaker is already planning our wedding. Mason chuckled, though something flickered in his eyes at her words. Likely has the church reserved and the menu planned. You should warn her not to get ahead of herself, Frances said, her tone lightening deliberately. I came to Truckee to teach, not to find a husband. And I've managed quite well on my own for 32 years, Mason agreed, though his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. No reason to complicate matters now. Yet as they stood together beneath the star-strewn Nevada sky, Frances couldn't help but feel that matters were already complicated by the way her heart quickened when he looked at her. By the comfort she found in his presence, by the sense that in him she had found someone who might understand the parts of herself she kept hidden from the world. When he escorted her home later that evening, Mason paused at her door, hat in hand. I'd like to call on you, Frances, he said directly, properly without a broken wagon or town social as an excuse. Frances hesitated, aware of all the reasons she should decline her commitment to her independence. The wounds from her past that had not yet fully healed. The whispers that would certainly follow if the new schoolteacher began keeping company with Mason Finley. I would like that, she found herself saying instead, his smile warm, genuine, and touched with relief made her breath catch. Sunday afternoon, perhaps, I could show you some of the countryside around Truckee. Sunday would be lovely. Mason nodded, seeming to restrain himself from saying more. Good night, Frances. Good night, Mason. After he had gone, Frances removed his coat from her shoulders, holding it for a moment before placing it carefully over the back of a chair. She would return it on Sunday, she decided. And perhaps by then, she would have convinced herself that her interest in Mason Finley was merely friendship, nothing more complicated or dangerous than that. Sunday dawned clear and warm, with a gentle breeze that rustled the pine trees surrounding Frances's cottage. She dressed with more care than she was willing to admit, choosing a practical riding skirt and jacket in deep green that complemented her auburn hair. Mason arrived promptly at 1 o'clock, leading 2 horses his own paint gelding and a gentle-looking bay mare. I borrowed her from the livery, he explained as he helped Frances mount. Molly Jenkins mentioned you were comfortable riding. Frances settled into the saddle, pleased by the mare's calm demeanor. I grew up riding in the countryside outside Boston, she confirmed, though it's been some time. They rode at a leisurely pace, Mason pointing out landmarks and sharing the history of the area. The landscape was breathtaking, towering pines giving way to meadows carpeted with wildflowers, distant mountains still capped with snow despite the summer heat. It's beautiful, Frances said as they paused on a ridge overlooking a crystal-clear lake, so different from Massachusetts. What was your life like there? Mason asked, his expression genuinely curious. Before you decided to come west, Frances hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. I taught at a girls' school in Boston for several years, she began carefully. My husband, the word still felt strange on her tongue. My husband was a lawyer with political ambitions. Was, Mason asked softly, noting her use of the past tense. He died, Frances said simply, looking out over the lake rather than at Mason. 15 months ago, Mason was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry. Don't be, Frances replied, more sharply than she intended. She softened her tone. Our marriage was not what I had hoped for. His death merely gave me the freedom to leave Boston and start anew, understanding dawned in Mason's eyes. And Truckee was as far as you could get, Frances nodded, grateful for his perception. I needed somewhere that Alexander Cooper's name meant nothing. Where I could simply be Frances Cooper, schoolteacher, rather than the widow of a man whose public reputation bore little resemblance to his private character. Mason studied her for a long moment, his blue eyes reflecting compassion without pity. We all have pasts we'd rather leave behind, he said finally. Out here, it's what you build going forward that matters. His words eased something tight in Frances's chest, the fear of judgment that had followed her from Boston, the worry that her secrets might somehow find their way west. What about you? She asked, eager to shift the focus from her own history. You mentioned your father's ranch in Texas, but not what brought you specifically to Nevada. Mason smiled slightly, a combination of good land prices and bad memories. He adjusted his hat against the sun. My father was a hard man, successful, respected, but demanding in ways that left little room for his sons to become men in their own right. My older brother, Mark, stayed to work the family ranch. I needed something of my own. And your mother, you mentioned she passed away. A shadow crossed Mason's features. Consumption, she fought it for years, but in the end. He trailed off, then squared his shoulders. After she died, there wasn't much holding me to Texas. Frances found herself wanting to reach out to offer comfort for a loss that still clearly pained him. Instead, she asked, no sweetheart left behind, no broken hearts when the handsome Finley son headed west, Mason chuckled, the sound warming the air between them. There was a girl, Eliza Thornton. Everyone in the county expected us to marry. His expression grew distant. But she wanted the Texas ranch, the Finley name, the security my father's position provided. When I told her I was heading west to build something of my own, she wished me well and set her sights on my brother instead. Did they marry? Frances asked, surprised by the sharp twinge of jealousy the question evoked. No, Mason replied, amusement evident in his voice. Mark saw through her quicker than I did. Last I heard, she'd married the banker's son. He turned to Frances, his gaze direct. I learned an important lesson from Eliza Thornton that a marriage built on convenience or advantage is no foundation for happiness. The conviction in his voice resonated with Frances's own hard-won wisdom. Her marriage to Alexander Cooper had been arranged by her father, a respected but financially strapped physician who had viewed the ambitious young lawyer as an advantageous match for his educated but portionless daughter. The years that followed had taught Frances the bitter consequences of such pragmatic unions. A difficult lesson, she acknowledged softly, and one I learned too late. Mason's eyes held hers, a current of understanding passing between them that required no further words. After a moment, he gestured toward a path leading down from the ridge. There's something I'd like to show you, if you're not too tired. They rode for another half-hour, descending into a secluded valley where a small cabin stood beside a bubbling creek. The structure was simple but well-crafted, with a covered porch and chimney of fitted stone. This is where I lived my first 2 years in Nevada, Mason explained as he helped Frances dismount. Built it myself while I was saving to buy the ranch property. Frances followed him onto the porch, noting the care evident in every detail: the smooth, planed railings, the tight-fitting door, the windows with actual glass rather than oiled paper. You built this? She asked, impressed by the craftsmanship. Mason nodded, a hint of pride in his expression. My grandfather was a carpenter before he turned to ranching. He taught me when I was young. He opened the door, gesturing for Frances to enter. It's not much, but it served me well. The interior was a single room with a stone fireplace, a handmade table and chairs, and a narrow bed in one corner. Simple shelves lined one wall, holding books that surprised Frances with their variety volumes of history, philosophy, and literature that seemed at odds with the popular conception of a frontier cattleman. She ran her fingers along the spines, noting titles she recognized from her own education. You're well-read for a cowboy, Mr. Finley. Mason smiled at her gentle teasing. My mother's influence. She believed education wasn't limited to schoolrooms. He moved to stand beside her, his presence warming the small space. I still come out here sometimes to read, to think, to remember why I came west in the first place. And why was that? Frances asked, turning to face him. Truly, his eyes met hers, startlingly blue in the golden afternoon light filtering through the windows. To find something authentic, he said softly. A life built with my own hands, relationships based on who I am rather than what I own, a future shaped by my own choices rather than others' expectations. The honesty in his voice touched something deep within Frances, a recognition of a kindred spirit seeking similar truths. She had come west fleeing the constraints of Boston society and the painful memories of her marriage, but also searching for something she had never fully experienced, the freedom to define herself on her own terms. Have you found it? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. This authentic life you sought, Mason's gaze never wavered from hers. Parts of it, the ranch is mine, built by my own labor. I answer to no one but myself." He paused, something vulnerable flickering in his expression. But a man alone, no matter how independent, finds himself wondering what it's all for. The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with unspoken possibilities. Frances was acutely aware of their isolation, the impropriety of being alone with Mason in this intimate setting. Yet she felt no fear, only a curious sense of standing at a crossroads, one path leading back to the safe, solitary life she had planned for herself in Truckee, the other toward something unknown but compelling. "We should head back," Mason said finally, breaking the moment with evident reluctance. "The sun will be setting soon, and I promise to have you home before dark." The ride back to Truckee was quieter, both lost in their own thoughts. As they approached the outskirts of town, Mason spoke again. "The school term begins tomorrow, doesn't it?" Frances nodded, grateful for the return to practical matters. 23 students, ages 6 to 16. I suspect it will be quite different from teaching in Boston. "The children here are eager to learn," Mason assured her, "though some of the older boys might test your authority at first." "Especially the Donovan twins," Frances smiled, confidence returning as the conversation turned to her profession. "I have some experience with reluctant scholars, Mr. Finley. I believe the Donovan twins will find me equal to their challenges." Mason chuckled, the sound rich in the gathering dusk. "I don't doubt it for a moment, Mrs. Cooper." When they reached her cottage, Mason dismounted first, then helped Frances from her saddle with strong, sure hands at her waist. The brief contact sent a flutter of awareness through her that she struggled to ignore. "Thank you for today," she said, stepping back to a more proper distance. "It was lovely to see more of the countryside." Mason nodded, his expression unreadable in the fading light. "Might I call on you again?" "Perhaps next Sunday." Frances hesitated, aware that accepting would send a clear message both to Mason and to the watchful eyes of Truckee. Regular Sunday visits from the eligible rancher would fuel speculation about their relationship, creating expectations she wasn't certain she was ready to embrace. Yet the prospect of not seeing him again produced a sharp pang she couldn't dismiss. "I would like that," she said finally. His smile, warm and genuine, confirmed she had made the right choice, despite her misgivings. "Until Sunday, then. Good luck with your first day of teaching." As Frances watched him ride away, leading the borrowed mare back to the livery, she acknowledged the truth she had been avoiding since their first meeting. Mason Finley had awakened feelings she had believed long buried beneath the ruins of her marriage hope: attraction, the dangerous possibility of trust. "Schoolmistresses do not entertain romantic notions about local ranchers," she reminded herself firmly as she entered her cottage. "Especially schoolmistresses with pasts they'd prefer to keep hidden." Yet as she prepared for bed, rehearsing lessons for the following day, Frances found her thoughts returning persistently to Mason, his quiet strength, his unexpected depth, the way his smile transformed his serious features into something that made her heart race. "Focus on your teaching," she admonished her reflection in the small mirror above her washbasin. "That's why you came to Truckee, not for blue-eyed cowboys with gentle hands and well-read minds." Her reflection offered no argument, but the flutter in her stomach whenever she thought of Sunday suggested her heart had other ideas entirely. The first day of school in Truckee proved both challenging and rewarding, just as Frances had anticipated. The students arrived with varying degrees of enthusiasm, the younger children bubbling with excitement, the older ones affecting bored indifference that didn't quite mask their curiosity about their new teacher. The Donovan twins, Patrick and Peter, 14 years old with identical mischievous grins, tested her authority immediately, whispering comments and passing notes when they thought she wasn't looking. Frances addressed their behavior directly, assigning them seats at opposite ends of the classroom and giving them additional reading to summarize by the next day. "You don't want to cross Mrs. Cooper," she overheard Molly Jenkins telling them during the midday break. "She's not like Mr. Winters, where she actually expects you to learn something." By the end of the day, Francis had established clear expectations for behavior and academic progress, assessed her students' varying levels of education, and begun to form connections with each child. She returned to her cottage tired but satisfied, knowing she had made the right decision in coming to Truckee. The week passed in a blur of lessons, grading, and preparation. Frances found herself too busy to dwell on thoughts of Mason Finley, though her pulse quickened whenever she caught sight of him in town during her errands. He tipped his hat respectfully but kept his distance, seemingly aware of the scrutiny any interaction between them would attract. Sunday arrived with anticipation that Frances tried unsuccessfully to suppress. She changed her dress twice before settling on a blue cotton that Mrs. Whittaker had assured her brought out the color of her eyes. Her hair, usually confined in a practical bun for teaching, she arranged in a softer style with a few curls framing her face. Mason arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, freshly shaved and wearing a clean shirt under his usual vest and coat. His eyes warmed appreciatively as they took in her appearance. "You look lovely," he said simply. Frances felt her cheeks warm at the directness of his compliment. "Thank you. Where are we going today?" "I thought you might enjoy seeing the ranch," Mason replied as he helped her into the wagon he had brought instead of horses. "If that's agreeable." The idea of seeing Mason's home, the place he had built from nothing, the physical manifestation of his dreams, filled Frances with unexpected pleasure. "I would like that very much." The journey to the ranch took just over an hour, during which Mason shared stories of his early days in Nevada, the challenges of establishing his herd, the hard winters, the satisfaction of seeing his efforts bear fruit. Frances listened with genuine interest, asking questions that revealed her quick intelligence and surprising knowledge of business matters. "My father insisted I understand practical economics," she explained when Mason expressed admiration for her grasp of cattle pricing. "He believed even women should be capable of managing household finances and basic investments." "A progressive view for a Boston physician," Mason observed. Frances smiled somewhat sadly. "My father was progressive in many ways except in his determination to see me suitably married. In that, he was entirely conventional." Mason's ranch, when they arrived, exceeded Frances's expectations. The main house was substantial, a 2-story structure built of solid pine with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. Nearby stood a large barn, bunkhouse, and various outbuildings, all constructed with the same attention to detail she had observed in Mason's cabin. A weathered man in his 60s emerged from the barn as they approached, his leathery face breaking into a genuine smile at the sight of Mason. "Didn't expect you back so early, boss," he called, his eyes flickering with interest to Frances. "Mrs. Cooper, this is Frank Miller, my foreman and the man who's kept this ranch running since the beginning," Mason said as he helped Frances from the wagon. "Frank, Mrs. Francis Cooper, Truckee's new schoolteacher." Frank removed his hat, revealing a shock of gray hair. "Madam, heard good things about you from the Jenkins girl, says you're teaching her extra after regular hours." Frances smiled, pleased by the unexpected connection. "Molly is a quick study with a genuine thirst for knowledge. Unlike my cowboys," Frank chuckled. "Only knowledge they thirst for is which saloon pours the strongest whiskey." Mason gave Frances a tour of the ranch, showing her the stables, the spring-fed pond where his cattle watered, and finally the house itself. The interior reflected the same practical elegance as the exterior well-crafted furniture, some purchased, but much of it bearing the marks of Mason's own craftsmanship, arranged in spacious rooms with large windows that captured the spectacular mountain views. "This is beautiful, Mason," Frances said as they stood in the main sitting room, where bookshelves lined one wall and a stone fireplace dominated another. "You've built something remarkable here." Pride and something deeper shone in his eyes as he watched her move around the room, examining the books and small decorative items, a carved wooden box, a polished stone paperweight, a delicate figurine of a horse that had been his mother's. "It's missing something vital, though," he said quietly. Frances turned to him, questioning. "Life," Mason continued, his gaze steady on hers. A house needs more than furniture and books to be a home. It needs voices, laughter, the sense that it's more than shelter, that it's the center of something meaningful. The implication of his words hung in the air between them, too significant to be misunderstood, yet still unspoken enough that Frances could choose not to acknowledge it directly. "Perhaps someday," she said carefully. Mason nodded, accepting her gentle deflection. "Mrs. Chen, my cook, has prepared dinner for us. Would you like to eat here or on the porch? The sunset from the western side is quite spectacular." They dined on the porch as the sun sank behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Mrs. Chen's cooking, a blend of Chinese traditions with Western ingredients, was delicious. And the conversation flowed easily as they discussed books. They had both read, shared stories of their respective childhoods, and debated the merits of various teaching philosophies. "You're not what I expected when I first saw you on that dusty trail," Mason admitted as they lingered over coffee and apple pie. Frances raised an eyebrow, amused. "And what did you expect, Mr. Finley?" Another Eastern lady coming west with romantic notions about frontier life, unprepared for its realities. His smile softened the assessment. "Instead, I found a woman of remarkable intelligence and strength who faces challenges directly and adapts to circumstances with grace." The sincerity in his voice touched Frances deeply. "And you are not the rough cowboy I initially took you for," she replied softly. "You've shown me kindness when I needed it, respect when many men would have offered pity, and conversation that engages rather than patronizes." Their eyes met across the table, the connection between them palpable in the gathering dusk. Mason reached across, his hand covering hers in a gentle touch that sent warmth spiraling through her. "Frances," he began, his voice low and serious. "I know you came to Truckee seeking independence, not attachment, and I respect that more than you know. But I find myself thinking of you at odd moments throughout the day, wondering what you might think of a particular view from the north pasture, imagining your voice in these rooms, wanting to share my thoughts with you and hear yours in return." Frances's heart raced at his words, a mixture of exhilaration and apprehension flooding through her. Part of her wanted to withdraw her hand, to retreat behind the walls she had built after Alexander's death. Yet another part, a part she had thought forever silenced, yearned to embrace the possibility Mason offered. "I'm not asking for promises or declarations," Mason continued, seeming to sense her internal conflict. "Only permission to court you properly, to see if what I feel growing between us might flourish given time and care." Frances took a steadying breath, her eyes never leaving his. "My experience with marriage was painful, Mason. Alexander was charming and attentive during our courtship, admired by everyone in Boston society. Once we wed, he revealed himself to be controlling, sometimes cruel, interested in me only as an ornament to his political ambitions." Mason's expression darkened, but he remained silent, allowing her to continue. "When he died in a carriage accident after leaving a mistress's home, though that detail was carefully concealed from public knowledge, I felt relief more than grief. And I promised myself I would never again surrender my independence to any man, no matter how appealing." "I would never ask you to surrender anything," Mason said quietly. "What I admire most about you is your spirit, your determination, your mind. I have no desire to diminish those qualities, only to stand beside you while you express them." His words, so different from anything Alexander had ever said, pierced the armor Frances had built around her heart. Still, caution held her back from embracing the feelings Mason stirred within her. "I need time, Mason," she finally said. "This is all happening so quickly, and I have responsibilities to the school, to my students." Mason squeezed her hand gently before releasing it. "Take all the time you need, Frances. I'm not going anywhere." His smile returned, warming his features in the lamplight. "Besides, I've waited 32 years to feel this way about a woman. I can certainly wait for you to decide if I'm worth the risk." As he drove her back to Truckee in the deepening twilight, Frances found herself studying his profile, impressed by the patience and understanding he had shown. Alexander would have pressed his advantage, used eloquence and persistence to wear down her resistance. Mason simply offered his feelings honestly, then gave her space to consider them without pressure. At her cottage door, Mason hesitated, clearly weighing propriety against desire. "May I continue to call on you, Sundays, perhaps, and maybe an occasional evening during the week?" Frances nodded, surprising herself with the eagerness she felt at the prospect. "I would like that." His smile, warm, genuine, touched with hope, made her breath catch. "Good night, Frances." "Good night, Mason." After he had gone, Frances sat in her rocking chair by the fireplace, contemplating the unexpected turn her life had taken. She had come to Truckee seeking solitude and independence, a place to rebuild her life away from painful memories. Instead, she had found Mason Finley, a man whose quiet strength and gentle manner challenged her assumptions about masculinity, whose intelligence and sensitivity belied his rugged exterior, whose presence made her feel both safer and more alive than she had in years. "It's too soon," she told herself firmly. "You barely know him." Yet as she prepared for bed, Frances couldn't deny the truth that had been growing since the moment Mason helped her from her collapsed wagon. For the first time since before her ill-fated marriage, she was beginning to believe that love, real love, based on mutual respect and genuine affection, might be possible for her after all. The autumn term progressed smoothly, with Frances establishing herself as a respected teacher who demanded excellence while providing encouragement. The children responded to her approach, even the initially reluctant Donovan twins, who discovered that Mrs. Cooper's literature lessons were far more engaging than the rote memorization their previous teacher had required. Mason kept his word, calling on Frances every Sunday and occasionally midweek for shorter visits. Their courtship for Frances had come to accept that was indeed what was happening, proceeded at a measured pace that respected her need for caution while allowing genuine feelings to develop between them. They rode together, exploring the countryside around Truckee. They read and discussed books from Mason's extensive library. They shared meals at her cottage and at his ranch. Through it all, Frances found herself increasingly drawn to Mason's combination of strength and gentleness, his respect for her independence and his willingness to reveal his own vulnerabilities. The town, predictably, buzzed with speculation about their relationship. Mrs. Whitaker took every opportunity to mention Mason's visits when Frances stopped at the general store, while Reverend Thompson began including thinly veiled references to the sanctity of marriage in his Sunday sermons. Frances endured the attention with as much grace as she could muster, though she occasionally wished for the anonymity she had initially sought in coming west. On a crisp October Sunday, Mason arrived at Frances's cottage with a proposal different from the one the town was expecting. "I need to drive cattle to Sacramento for sale," he explained as they walked along the river path. "I'll be gone about 2 weeks." Frances felt a surprising pang at the thought of his absence. In the 3 months since their first meeting, Mason had become an integral part of her life, a source of companionship, intellectual stimulation, and increasing emotional connection. "When do you leave?" she asked, trying to keep her tone casual. "Wednesday morning." Mason hesitated, then continued with uncharacteristic uncertainty. "I was hoping, that is, I wondered if you might consider writing to me while I'm away." The request, so simple yet intimate, touched Frances deeply. "Of course I'll write to you, Mason." His smile warmed the autumn air between them. "And perhaps when I return we might discuss the future." The implication in his words caused Frances's heart to race. Though neither had spoken directly of marriage, the possibility had hovered unacknowledged in their conversations, in the way Mason's eyes followed her movements, in the careful restraint he showed when they parted each evening. "The future," she repeated, both thrilled and apprehensive. Mason took her hand, his touch gentle but certain. "I love you, Frances. I've known it since that first dance at the welcome social, perhaps even since I found you standing beside your collapsed wagon. These past months have only deepened that feeling." The declaration, though not unexpected, still took her breath away. Francis looked up into his blue eyes, seeing the sincerity and vulnerability reflected there. "You don't need to say anything now," Mason continued, his thumb tracing small circles on the back of her hand. "Take these 2 weeks to consider what you want for yourself, for us. When I return, we can talk about possibilities." Francis nodded, grateful for his understanding yet feeling a curious emptiness at the thought of 2 weeks without his presence. "I'll miss you," she admitted softly. Mason raised her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "And I you, Francis, more than you know." The following Sunday, the first in months that Francis had spent alone, she found herself restless and unsettled. The cottage that had seemed so perfect upon her arrival now felt strangely empty. She attempted to grade papers, to plan lessons, to read, but her thoughts continually returned to Mason. In the evening, she sat at her mother's writing desk and began a letter, pouring onto paper the feelings she had been carefully guarding. "My dear Mason, the cottage seems uncommonly quiet without the prospect of your visit. I find myself listening for the sound of your horses' hooves on the path, turning expectantly when the door creaks in the wind, missing your voice and your presence in ways I had not anticipated. You asked me to consider what I want for my future during your absence. I have been doing little else since you departed. The truth, which both exhilarates and frightens me, is that I can no longer imagine a future without you in it. When I came to Truckee, I was determined to remain independent, to build a life defined by my teaching rather than by attachment to any man. I had convinced myself that love was a luxury I could no longer afford after the painful lessons of my marriage. Yet you have shown me a different kind of love, one built on respect rather than control, on partnership rather than dominance, on genuine affection rather than social advantage. You have been patient with my caution, understanding of my fears, supportive of my independence even as you offer me connection. I realize now that true independence is not the absence of attachment, but the freedom to choose whom to love and how to express that love. And I choose you, Mason Finley, with clear eyes and an open heart. I love you. The words seem simultaneously inadequate and overwhelming, yet they are true. I love your strength and your gentleness, your intelligence and your honesty, the life you have built with your own hands and the space you make in it for others' dreams. When you return, we will talk of the future, our future, if you still wish it to be so. Until then, know that you are in my thoughts constantly. With deepest affection, Francis sealed the letter, addressing it to Mason in Sacramento, where he had arranged to receive mail during his cattle drive. As she handed it to the postmaster the following morning, she felt a curious sense of liberation, as if acknowledging her feelings for Mason, even in a letter he had not yet read, had released something long constrained within her. The next 10 days passed slowly, filled with teaching duties and social obligations that Francis fulfilled with outward composure while her thoughts frequently strayed to Mason and his likely reception of her letter. She received a brief note from him midway through his absence, written from the trail and expressing his hope that her days were pleasant and her students well behaved. The formality of his words suggested he had written before receiving her more revealing correspondence. On the afternoon Mason was expected to return, Francis dismissed her students early, ignoring their curious glances and knowing whispers. She changed from her practical teaching dress into the blue gown Mason had admired, arranged her hair with more care than usual, and waited with mounting anticipation. When the knock finally came, Francis opened the door to find Mason standing on her porch, trail dust still clinging to his clothes, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and barely contained emotion. "You're back," she said unnecessarily, her heart racing at the intensity of his gaze. "I got your letter in Sacramento," he replied without preamble. "Read it so many times the paper's nearly worn through." He took a step closer, still not touching her. "Did you mean it, Francis? All of it?" Francis nodded, finding her voice. "Every word." Mason reached for her then, his arms encircling her waist as he drew her to him. "I love you," he whispered against her hair. God help me, I love you more than I thought possible." Their first kiss was gentle, a tentative exploration that quickly deepened into something more profound. Francis felt the careful restraint in Mason's embrace, his desire tempered by respect, his passion guided by tenderness. When they finally parted, both breathless, she saw in his eyes the same wonder she felt. "Marry me," Mason said softly, his hands framing her face. "Not because you need protection or security, but because I want to build a life with you, a true partnership of equals. Because I want to wake up beside you every morning and fall asleep next to you every night. Because I love you, Francis Cooper, exactly as you are." Tears blurred Francis's vision as she nodded, overwhelmed by the sincerity in his voice, the love in his eyes, the future opening before them. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you, Mason Finley." Their engagement announcement caused precisely the stir in Truckee that Francis had anticipated. Mrs. Whittaker declared she had known from the first moment they would end up together, while Mayor Harrison congratulated Mason with hearty backslaps and knowing winks. The children in Francis's class peppered her with questions about her wedding plans and whether she would continue teaching afterward. "Of course I'll continue teaching," she assured them, touched by their concern. "Being Mrs. Finley doesn't mean I'll stop being your teacher." "But the ranch is so far from town," Mary Donovan, the twins' younger sister, pointed out with practical concern. "How will you get here every day?" It was a question Francis and Mason had discussed at length during the week following their engagement. The ranch was indeed too distant for a daily commute, especially during the harsh Nevada winters. "Mr. Finley is building a house closer to town," Francis explained, the solution they had reached together. "We'll live there during the school terms and at the ranch during holidays and summers." What she didn't share with her students was the joy she had felt when Mason proposed this arrangement, further evidence of his commitment to supporting her career and independence, even as they joined their lives together. The new house, situated on land Mason purchased just outside Truckee, took shape quickly under his skilled hands and those of the workers he hired to assist. Francis visited the construction site regularly, offering suggestions for the layout and design that Mason incorporated with evident pleasure in her involvement. "It will be ready by Christmas," he promised as they stood together on what would become their front porch, surveying the progress. Just in time for the wedding. They had agreed to marry during the winter break, allowing Francis to complete the fall term and giving them a week of privacy before classes resumed in January. Reverend Thompson would perform the ceremony in Truckee's small church, followed by a celebration at the town hall that promised to be the social event of the season, if Mrs. Whittaker's enthusiastic planning was any indication. As the wedding day approached, Francis found herself reflecting on the extraordinary turn her life had taken in just 6 months. She had arrived in Truckee seeking solitude and a fresh start, determined to build a life independent of male protection or control. Instead, she had found in Mason Finley a partner who valued her strength rather than seeing it as a threat, who supported her independence while offering a love that enhanced rather than diminished her sense of self. The day before the wedding, Francis sat at her mother's writing desk, composing one final letter as Francis Cooper before she would become Francis Finley. This one was addressed to her father in Boston, the first communication she had sent east since arriving in Nevada. "Dear Father, I hope this letter finds you in good health. I know my departure from Boston was abrupt, and my silence since then has likely caused you concern. Please know that it was never my intention to worry you, only to find the space I needed to heal from the wounds of my marriage and Alexander's death. I am writing now with news that I hope will bring you joy. I am to be married tomorrow to a man named Mason Finley, a cattle rancher whose kindness, intelligence, and integrity have restored my faith in the possibility of true partnership between husband and wife. Unlike my marriage to Alexander, which you arranged with the best of intentions but which brought me only pain, this union is one I have chosen freely, with clear eyes and an open heart. Mason loves me for who I am rather than what advantages I might bring him. He supports my teaching career and values my independence even as he offers me his protection and affection. I have found happiness here in Truckee, Father, in my classroom, in this community, and especially in Mason's love. I hope that knowing this brings you peace regarding my decision to leave Boston. Perhaps someday you might visit us here in Nevada. I think you would find much to admire in the man I have chosen, and I know he would welcome the opportunity to know the father who raised the woman he loves. With deepest affection, your daughter, Frances. As Frances sealed the letter, she felt a sense of completion, of circles closing and new ones beginning. The past no longer held the power to define her future. Tomorrow, she would begin a new chapter of her life as Mason Finley's wife, carrying forward not the bitter lessons of her first marriage, but the healing truths of her second chance at love. The wedding day dawned clear and cold, with fresh snow blanketing Truckee in pristine white that glittered in the winter sunshine. Frances stood at her cottage window, watching the early morning light transform the landscape, feeling a profound sense of rightness about the step she was about to take. Molly Jenkins arrived mid-morning to help Frances prepare, her young face alight with excitement as she carefully arranged Frances's hair and helped her into the elegant ivory dress that Mrs. Whitaker had insisted on ordering from Sacramento. "You look beautiful, Mrs. Cooper," Molly said, stepping back to admire her handiwork. "Mr. Finley won't know what hit him." Frances smiled, touched by the girl's enthusiasm. "Thank you, Molly, not just for today, but for your friendship these past months. I hope you'll continue your studies with me after the wedding." "Even though you'll be living in the new house?" Molly asked hopefully. "Especially then," Frances assured her. "The house has a proper library. Mason insisted on it, and plenty of space for advanced lessons." The church, when they arrived, was filled to capacity with what seemed to be every resident of Truckee. Frances paused in the vestibule, momentarily overwhelmed by the magnitude of the occasion and the public nature of the commitment she was about to make. "Ready, Mrs. Cooper?" Mayor Harrison asked, offering his arm. In the absence of her father, he had volunteered to escort her down the aisle, a gesture that had touched Frances deeply. She took a steadying breath, then placed her hand on his arm. "Ready, Mr. Harrison." As the church doors opened and the assembled guests rose to their feet, Frances's gaze found Mason waiting at the altar. The love and wonder in his eyes as he watched her approach banished any lingering doubts. This was not the calculated social transaction her first marriage had been. This was a true union of hearts, entered into with full knowledge and genuine affection. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of emotion. Frances would later remember little of Reverend Thompson's words or the specific vows they exchanged. What remained vivid in her memory was the warmth of Mason's hands holding hers, the depth of feeling in his voice as he promised to cherish and respect her all the days of his life, and the profound sense of coming home she felt when he gently kissed her as husband and wife. The celebration afterward was everything Mrs. Whitaker had promised: abundant food, music from the local fiddlers, and dancing that continued well into the evening. Frances found herself passed from partner to partner as the townspeople took turns offering congratulations and, in many cases, gentle teasing about how quickly the independent new schoolteacher had succumbed to Mason Finley's charms. "Don't pay them any mind, Mrs. Whitaker advised during a brief moment of respite. "They're just pleased to see Mason settled with a woman worthy of him. He's been alone too long, that one." "As have I," Frances replied softly, her eyes finding Mason across the room where he was engaged in conversation with Frank Miller and several of his ranch hands. As if sensing her gaze, Mason looked up, his expression softening as their eyes met. He excused himself from his companions and made his way to her side, taking her hand in his with the easy familiarity of a gesture that already felt like habit. "Ready to depart, Mrs. Finley?" he asked quietly. "I know we promised to stay until the end, but I find myself increasingly eager for privacy." The warmth in his eyes sent a shiver of anticipation through Frances. "Yes," she said simply. "Take me home, Mason." Their departure was met with good-natured cheers and ribald comments that would have scandalized Boston society, but merely made Frances laugh as Mason handed her into the waiting sleigh. Wrapped in warm blankets against the winter chill, they set off toward their new house, leaving behind the lights and music of the celebration. "Happy?" Mason asked as the sleigh glided smoothly over the snow-covered road, the sound of bells mingling with the steady rhythm of the horses' hooves. Frances leaned against his shoulder, content in a way she had never expected to experience again after the disillusionment of her first marriage. "Happier than I thought possible," she admitted. "You've given me a gift I never thought to receive, Mason, not just love, but the kind of love that allows me to be fully myself while still being part of something larger." Mason's arm tightened around her. "That goes both ways, Frances. I built a ranch, a business, a life here in Nevada, but until you came along, I didn't realize what was missing." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "You make it all matter." Their new home, when they arrived, welcomed them with warm light glowing from the windows. Mason had arranged for Mrs. Chen to prepare the house earlier in the day, lighting fires in the main rooms and leaving a cold supper in the kitchen for when they might want it. Mason lifted Frances from the sleigh and carried her across the threshold, both of them laughing at the traditionalism of the gesture, yet appreciating its symbolism nonetheless. Inside, the house reflected their shared tastes, practical yet beautiful, with Mason's craftsmanship evident in the custom-built shelves that housed Frances's books alongside his own, the sturdy furniture designed for comfort rather than show, the large windows that would frame spectacular views when daylight returned. "It's perfect," Frances said, turning in a slow circle to take it all in. "Exactly what I would have chosen." Mason smiled, pleased by her approval. "It's just the beginning," he promised. "We'll build our life here together day by day." Later, as they lay entwined in the bedroom that still smelled faintly of fresh-cut pine, Frances rested her head on Mason's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear. His fingers traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder, the gentle touch speaking of affection that transcended the physical passion they had shared. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," she confessed in the darkness. "After Alexander, I believed that part of me was dead, the part capable of trust, of vulnerability, of love." Mason's arms tightened around her. "I'm grateful every day that Wagon axle broke," he said, his voice rumbling beneath her cheek. "Might never have met you otherwise." Frances smiled at the memory, her initial despair at the collapsed wagon, the relief and wariness she had felt at Mason's approach, the surprising connection that had formed as they salvaged her possessions together. "From disaster to destiny," she murmured sleepily. Mason pressed a kiss to her hair. "The best kind of journey." As Frances drifted towards sleep in her husband's embrace, she reflected on the extraordinary path that had led her to this moment, from Boston widow to Nevada bride, from wounded survivor to beloved partner. The wagon's collapse had seemed a catastrophe at the time, yet it had ultimately delivered her to exactly where she belonged. In the arms of a man who valued her strength as much as her softness, who had unloaded her broken wagon and, in the process, loaded her heart with a love more precious than anything she had lost. 10 years later, Frances stood on the porch of the ranch house, watching as Mason taught their 8-year-old son, Thomas, how to properly saddle a horse. Nearby, their 6-year-old daughter, Elizabeth, sat on the steps, earnestly explaining the plot of her latest book to her 3-year-old brother, James, who listened with the patience only a younger sibling could muster for an elder's enthusiasms. The decade had brought changes both expected and surprising. The ranch had prospered beyond even Mason's ambitious plans, becoming one of the largest and most respected cattle operations in Nevada. Frances had continued teaching in Truckee until Thomas's birth, then established a small school on the ranch property for their children and those of the ranch hands and nearby homesteaders. Her reputation as an educator had spread throughout the region, and several of her former students, including Molly Jenkins, had gone on to become teachers themselves. Their house in town had been sold to Truckee's new doctor and his wife, as the family now lived permanently at the ranch in the expanded main house that accommodated both their growing family and Francis's educational activities. The original cabin where Mason had first lived still stood beside the creek, now serving as a quiet retreat where he occasionally went to read or think, and where Francis sometimes joined him for private conversations away from the busy household. "Mama, look." Thomas called excitedly as he mounted his pony under Mason's watchful eye. "I did it myself," Francis waved acknowledgement, her heart swelling with pride at her son's accomplishment and gratitude for the life she and Mason had built together. Their marriage had weathered its share of challenges, the drought that threatened the herd 3 years after their wedding, Francis's difficult pregnancy with Elizabeth, the death of Mason's father in Texas that had required a journey east, and a painful reconciliation before the end. Through it all, they had maintained the partnership they had promised each other on their wedding day, consulting on important decisions, supporting each other's dreams, balancing independence with intimacy in a dance that had grown more graceful with practice. "You're thinking deep thoughts," Mason observed as he joined her on the porch, leaving Thomas to practice his riding in the yard. At 42, Mason had lost none of his vigor, though silver now threaded the dark hair at his temples and the lines around his eyes had deepened from years of squinting in the Nevada sun. Francis smiled up at him, still moved by the tenderness in his gaze after a decade together. "Just appreciating our life," she replied, leaning into his side as his arms circled her shoulders. "Remembering how it all began. With a broken wagon and a schoolteacher who looked at me like I might be planning to rob her," Mason chuckled, the memory still amusing after all these years. "You can hardly blame me," Francis protested with mock indignation. "A strange man appearing out of nowhere while I was stranded and vulnerable, any sensible woman would have been cautious." Mason pressed a kiss to her temple, his voice softening. "And yet you trusted me enough to let me help. Brave then, brave now, one of the countless things I love about you, Mason Finley." The sound of galloping hooves drew their attention as Frank Miller, now in his 70s but still serving as foreman, rode into the yard with a packet of mail from town. Among the business correspondence and catalogs was a letter addressed to Francis in Molly Jenkins's neat hand. "She's accepted the position," Francis announced after scanning the contents. "Superintendent of schools for the entire county, the first woman to hold the position." Pride colored her voice. Molly had been not just a student but a protégée, benefiting from Francis's guidance and Mason's financial support to attend a teacher's college in California. Her appointment represented a significant advancement for women's professional opportunities in the region. "We should invite her to dinner to celebrate," Mason suggested. "Sunday, perhaps," Francis nodded, already mentally planning the meal and conversation. These Sunday gatherings had become a tradition over the years, friends and neighbors welcomed to their table for good food and better company. The ranch house filled with laughter and lively discussion late into the evening. As the afternoon light lengthened into early evening, the family gathered for supper in the spacious dining room. Mason, as always, sat at the head of the table with Francis at the foot, the children arranged between them along with the current schoolteacher who boarded with them and 2 young cowboys who were working through their meal in exchange for helping with the spring branding. Looking around the table at the lives intertwined with theirs, Francis felt a profound sense of fulfillment. The journey from that dusty Nevada trail where her wagon had collapsed to this moment had not been without difficulties or disappointments, but it had brought richness and joy beyond anything she could have imagined when she fled Boston seeking only independence and peace. Later, after the children were tucked into bed with stories and kisses, Francis and Mason sat together on the porch swing, watching the stars emerge in the vast Nevada sky. His arm rested comfortably around her shoulders, her head against his chest in the easy intimacy of long marriage. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if your wagon hadn't broken that day?" Mason asked, his fingers playing idly with a strand of her hair that had escaped its pins. Francis considered the question seriously. I suppose I would have reached Truckee on my own, taken up teaching as planned, maintained my independence. Been happy, Mason pressed gently. Content, perhaps, she conceded, but not happy, not like this. She turned to look up at him, at the face that had become as familiar and beloved as her own. Some burdens are too heavy to carry alone, Mason. I needed you to unload more than just my wagon that day. Mason smiled, the expression still making her heart quicken after all their years together. Best work I ever did, he said softly, helping with that collapsed wagon. Never expected the payment would be so precious. As the evening deepened around them, Frances thanked whatever fate or providence had broken her wagon axle on that dusty trail a decade ago, bringing Mason Finley into her life, and giving her the chance to discover that true independence wasn't found in isolation, but in the freedom to choose love and to build, day by day and year by year, a partnership that strengthened rather than diminished both people within it. The wagon had collapsed, but what had risen from that moment was stronger, more beautiful, and infinitely more precious than anything Frances had lost along the way.